All right, awesome. Oh, you know what? And let me also open this on the side. Okay, so thank you. Oh, and you're also going to get to know Winston because he has a bad habit of hanging out on the bed behind me whenever I'm presenting. So I hope if you enjoy dogs, I hope you enjoy the weird stuff he's bound to do behind me as we go. So thank you all for joining us today for Driving DEI with Data. And before we dive in, just for a little bit of fun, wanted to just go ahead and kind of play a little fun game and just show you some quotes. So here's some quotes here. What's the ROI on DEI? Right, that's a big one. Everything's fine. We don't have a diversity problem. Emphasis on just diversity, right? DEI can't be measured. It's all about feelings. There's no measurement. And then we already collect engagement data, So that being said, just as a fun way for us to get to know each other a little bit, I have a little poll. How many of you have ever had someone say something like one of these quotes to you? Whether it was a colleague or a boss, or even, maybe you're talking to someone else about their organization. Have you heard any of these quotes on the screen in regards to DEI in the workplace? All right, I'm seeing we got a lot of responses, and so far only one no, and that's out of most of you. So on the flip side, just for fun, the other question is, how many of you have ever said any of these? Have you ever said any of these quotes on the screen? All right, seeing a little bit more of a mix here, about half and half. Oh, now we're leaning more towards the no side. Okay, so mostly no's on this one. I'll show you the data over here. Mostly no's on this one. Cool. Well, I just thought that would be a fun way to start. As external DEI consultants, these are some of the things we do hear a lot of times, especially because we are so data focused in our approach. And we're going to touch on these quotes as we go through today. That's the whole point of our conversation. So that being said, let's get into the agenda. So we're going to start with just some introductions, and then we'll touch on why measuring DEI is so important. What does DEI data look like? So the what, and then the how. So how should we be collecting and using DEI data? And then after that, we'll just sum that up with some takeaways for you at the end, but definitely leaving time for Q&A. So we're gonna get into some details and then leave time for Q&A at the end, and we'll wrap up. So that being said, I'm gonna address the elephant in the room, right? For those of you who are invited, you probably saw, and actually I think a lot of the communications came from Victoria. She's my business partner. She's the CEO of Mattingly Solutions. I'm co-founder and chief consulting officer. Unfortunately, today, one of our clients, they are dealing with some pretty intense things at their organization, and so she has to be on site. And so while she is taking the time to focus on supporting them, I'm going to take over today and focus on supporting you all in your journey around using DEI data. So we're going to have a good time, and Victoria sends her best and wishes that she could have still attended. So that is that. And then, as I mentioned today, also, while Victoria and I were going to lead the session, we do have a number of teammates at Mattingly Solutions who support us. One being here today is Kim Mariah, who's another one of our founding team, and then also Julie, who's one of our consulting assistants. So glad they could be here, and also appreciate the support we get from the rest of our team. And we are largely made up of organizational psychologists here at Mattingly Solutions, which is the science of human behavior in the workplace. And that's why we take such a data-driven approach to DEI. And the last little note there is that we have a book coming out kind of summarizing this similar topic as well. So that's really exciting things going on over here. But that is definitely enough about me. So next, I just wanted to hear a little bit more about some of you. So I have some more polls just to kind of see who's with us today. So I'm going to launch this one. And this one's just asking, what's your role? So are you, CEO? And I'll slide this over so we can check that out. We got CEOs, CDO, CHRO, maybe some VPs, directors, some external people, students. If you're other and you want to drop it in chat, I would love to hear what other titles we have. So just wanted to get a feel of who's in the room, and it feels like we have kind of all levels being covered, which is always exciting. Awesome. And we got 30 responses. I'll give it a few more seconds, see if those last 10 people drop a response. Lots of others. I hope y'all drop it in the chat. I tried real hard to think of all the titles that might be interested in showing up today. So love that. Awesome, awesome. Okay, so the next question is, what's the size of your company? So have a number of people who are maybe startups, smaller size. Are you large organization? All right, seeing a pretty good spread here, kind of all over the board. Looking in my comments too, DEIB consultant and strategist, another consultant, implementation lead. All right. Loving your job titles. Thanks for sharing, and give it a few more seconds. See if the last, like, what is that, 14 or so people want to respond to their company size. But it's looking like, you know, pretty spread out, but maybe more on the smaller size here. Awesome. All right, one more question. Humor me one more time. This last one. How confident are you in your ability to drive DEI with data at your organization? And that could be, you feel like you know what you're doing, or you feel like you can get access to the data, right? So there's kind of two sides of that question. Or you can get buy-in to collect the data. How are you feeling about that? Seeing those trickle in. Not too many people too far on the extremes, maybe a little bit more in this middle here. All right. Awesome, awesome. Loving your comments too. Thanks for adding. And if you couldn't tell, this is going to be, it's not just one of those webinars where I'm going to talk at you the whole time. I'm going to try and sprinkle in some more interactivity as we go through as well. So definitely feel free to, like I said, come on camera and I'm looking at your faces on the side, or use the chat, use the reactions. Would love to see how this is all resonating with you. But for now, we're going to go ahead and dive in to the next section here. So starting with, like I said, the why of DEI and data, right? So with that, I do have one more interaction, and that is, what is one challenge you face when it comes to increasing the effectiveness of DEI initiatives at your organization? So go ahead and drop that in chat and I can read that out, or if you're comfortable, just come off mute, raise your hand, and we can take turns kind of going around. We'll do this for about 30 seconds, a minute or so. What are some of those challenges you're facing around increasing effectiveness of DEI in your organization? Getting agency to buy in, yep. Newly launched initiatives, so figuring out what to measure and target. That's a good one, definitely. Education and buy-in, yep. Anyone else want to share? I think that buy-in is a really big one, showing the importance. Financial debt of no DEI. Yeah, that's really great. +1, agreement on what and how to measure so that you have that compatibility, right? That's a really important piece, just not measuring anything, but making sure there's a plan there. Getting approval for new initiatives and policy. Yeah, there's a lot there. So this is really great. And what we found is there's a study actually that shows that it was done with HR professionals, and it found that the most common barrier was a lack of metrics to identify where they were lacking in regards to DEI. So this syncs up with some of the things that we were seeing in the comments there. And it's that, you know, it's similar to the chicken or the egg situation. Leaders want to know the data to be able to give you that buy-in and support, but if they don't give you the buy-in and support, you can't collect your own data. So how do you go about getting that to start, right? So since you may be starting from a place where you're lacking metrics to identify your DEI needs, or you're not sure what to be measuring, and again, with that buy-in, lacking support to even be allowed to collect the necessary metrics, it can be really useful to rely on external research about why DEI is important in the first place and how measuring helps you in your journey to improve your DEI initiative. So that external aspect is really useful. So if we're going to talk about external, right, what is some of that? So what's some of those pieces that you can maybe talk about? Why, what's the why DEI? Well, aside from, I'm sure if you're all here, you're all already bought it, right? Aside from it being the right thing to do, it's the moral imperative. DEI is important from a business perspective, and it is key to go ahead and continue that. Sorry, I just want to make sure I share my right thing for a second. It's important to share that with your leaders, because unfortunately, not everyone cares about the moral side, right? So it's important to highlight that research has shown that more diverse, equitable, and inclusive companies outperform their competitors. And having a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive company improves things like the employee experience. And employees who feel that sense of belonging, they are going to stick around longer, therefore reducing your costs related to turnover and low engagement. And when that happens, it's also going to improve their performance and increase things like innovation and creativity, and also decision making. And when you have all of these things, right, not only are you helping create a healthier environment for your employees, so the moral side, but when they're in a better environment, it also improves profitability for the organization. So it's important, you know, it is a business. So leaning into that is okay, and how it's still supporting the business, even if it is also the right thing to do. Well, with that, why measurement, right? And I'm sure some of you have seen, and if you haven't, I know your leaders have, I've had these conversations, there's research out there that questions the extent to the benefit of DEI in organizations, right? And it's kind of pushing back on some of that other research that I referenced. And that's because the exact benefits of DEI is going to vary a little bit by organization. But that furthers your argument of why measuring internally is so important. It's critical for you to measure and figure out, you know, what aspects of DEI are important in your organization and how you're doing in that regard and what you could do to improve. So that's a really big key there. And I also always like to say at this point that, you know, you measure everything else in business, why not measure DEI? Anything else that is a strategic imperative, you know, a goal and objective for your organization you're measuring. So DEI should be along that, especially because it's ingrained in everything that you do. So those things are really important. And so then, yeah, the next thing here is going ahead and looking deeper into measurement and why it matters. So first of all, data is going to tell you where to focus your efforts and where to pivot if need be. And the first step in that is starting with a baseline assessment. That's going to tell you where to focus. Taking that data-driven approach also helps gain buy-in from not only your leaders, but from your employees as well. They can see, okay, they mean business, they're looking at this the right way, they're getting into it. So having that data-driven approach is a really important first step. And then using that to create your strategy. So telling you, all right, this is the area where we should focus. And once you have that strategy, continuing to measure. It's tracking your progress towards your goal, collecting and analyzing data in order to measure, you know, where are you and how are things going? So also looking at your impact, measuring how, was it useful, was it successful, and maybe course correcting if it wasn't helping you in the ways you'd hoped. So that's all important as far as getting there, but it also addresses that big question we had in the beginning, that quote, right? The ROI, because now that you've done this work and you're saying DEI is important, you can show, you know, hey, here's how it's having an impact and why we should continue to have these conversations, because you can't just measure once and say, yep, okay, we're good to go. That's all we needed to do. So that's a little bit about why DEI and measurement and some of the conversations we have in that space. But I want to dig a little bit deeper into the pushback, especially because buy-in did come up a lot. And when it comes to buy-in, a lot of times we hear a lot of concerns. There's a lot of pushback of, you know, oh, I'm not sure. And some of the most common concerns we hear is, you know, it's going to be divisive. If we focus on DEI, it's more likely to push people apart, and we're going to have backlash from the majority groups. Another concern we tend to hear is legal repercussions. There's concerns of, you know, what's this going to do for us when it comes to potential lawsuits. just blunt, that's a common concern. And then another one is a fear of, well, we can't even get the right data. Nobody responds to our surveys, or nobody does the interviews. Maybe we don't have people in that group. And then another one is, you know, if we collect all this data, we don't know what to do with it. What are we going to do with this data once we have it? And so those are some of the concerns, but now let's talk about the good side, right? So when it comes to the first one with divisiveness, DEI work is not focusing only on people of color and ignoring the needs of white employees. You know, it's not pointing out differences to divide employees across or creating fault lines or anything like that. DEI work is about promoting inclusive behaviors to retain the best talent, and that's to help all identity groups. Now, I will say there are subsets. So for instance, if we said this session was on anti-racism, then that is focused on race, and that would be the conversation, you know. But if you're taking this broad approach at the high level, your first step, you're just getting started, then you're focusing on all identities. So that distinction is really important when you're having these conversations, is labeling what type of work and what your priorities are. So that's a key there on that first one. And then the next one about legal, this conversation gets me. It's not a purely legal issue. Sure, there are some compliance aspects, especially depending on the industry you're in, right? But it's bigger than that. But I think the thing that really makes me chuckle with this concern is it's not a secret, right? So there's no need to be afraid of your demographic data. Your employees can look around and they can see that. You also don't have to worry about any other negative side effects that might come up in conversation, because they already know that too. They're feeling it. Your employees can feel it even if you don't tell them. Or maybe you don't have those issues, but they're feeling it, but there's no data for you to rely on to say, actually, that isn't a problem. You just telling them it's not a problem isn't the same as you being able to say, hey, actually, we collected data and here's where we are with this. So that's one side. And then another side I always want to point out, which hurts my heart a little bit as someone who really believes in this work, but it is important to note, is that for better or worse, at least US based, the legal system is actually more supportive of the business anyway in this regard. I'm not a lawyer, so this is not official legal advice, but in very simple terms, when it comes to things like discrimination suits and so on, as long as the business is showing that they're trying to improve, that they're aware of the issue and they're putting in the work, there's not much of a case. And so honestly, it's funny because there's this fear of talking about the data, but really having that data, reporting it out, creating a data-driven strategy, and following through on actions to correct in the areas where you have, you know, opportunities for improvement is actually your best legal case to support you and avoid lawsuits. So just another funny angle I have on that legal fear that tends to come up. The next one, capturing enough data. So here, when it comes to Small Inside, this concern may come from thinking that people won't respond, and that's going to just take time. If you have concerns already with your employees around transparency and communication, all you can do is show them, right? Showing them the behavior is better than just talking about it. So go ahead and do that effort, try and collect the data, do that survey, and even if you don't get a great response rate, acknowledge it. Tell them, hey, we got this data. This is what we saw. This is what we're doing as a result, and building on that. And that will help them see, oh, you know, I can see why they collected this data. I can see what they're doing with it. They did listen to my voice. And then the next time you try and collect data, you're going to have more and more people willing to respond. So that transparency and communication is really key. And like I mentioned earlier, the other concern when it comes to not having enough responses is from people who they're like, well, I don't have any, you know, Black female, I always pick on my own identity when I'm speaking. So I don't have any Black female employees. Well, you know, if you only have a couple, it's still important to hear the voice of those, let's say 3, right? You have 3 Black females out of your whole organization. Well, that's important. They responded. Do something about what they said. See how their experience is. And that's going to help them, even if it is a small group, that's still helping that group. And then also, it's going to help with attraction. And so then hopefully you will have more people in that group, and that in the future, you'll, you know, have more representation there. So that's a little bit on that piece. And then this last one, is in relation to that as well, right? So I talked about how transparency and communication is important, but also the action is wrapped into that. So you can't just identify the problems. I will say it's important to note your problems and report it out internally to everyone and maybe even externally if you're feeling really progressive, but you can't just open the curtain and say, hey, we are a mess, because that would scare anyone. And so that's why it's important to say, hey, we're a mess, but this is what we're doing to clean it up. These are the steps we're taking, we already have in place. These are the things we're investigating and trying to figure out. Here's how we got to this point. So it's painting that whole picture, but then again, it's not just talking about it, it's then following through. And so you're doing those actions that you said you're going to do based on your data. And furthermore, also then giving them more updates. So, you know, sometimes it's very easy to just say, hey, here's the report, here's what we're going to do. See you next year. Well, no, a couple months later, this is where we are. This is the progress we've made. A couple months later, here's now what we're doing. You know, so that continuous communication, it really connects. Those last two bullets tie together. So that's a lot there on the why, but now let's get into the what. So another interactive activity I'd love for you to help me participate in and see how we're doing. What data are you currently collecting to measure DEI and B in your organization? So again, feel free to come off mute if you'd like, or drop a chat. Just any kind of data you can think of. And you can put them in one at a time too if you want, sprinkle them in there. Happy to read them out. We got turnover, recruitment, pipeline. Oh, I love that where you're looking at your pipeline. That's a good one. What else we got going on? Retention, okay. Leaders versus non-leaders. That's a good call out, right? It's not just about where you're getting the data in the cycle, but also how are you looking at the data? Benay, hey, so we got experience assessments, job, KPIs, satisfaction scores, surveys, right? Yep, I love surveys, that's my background. Representation across levels, that's that diversity. Yeah, applicant tracking, year-over-year progression. Holly, that's a really good one. Looking at the students applying to your program success rates, that's a good one too. Awesome. All right, these are a lot of good examples. So we're gonna dive into this a little more now. So when it comes to measuring, there are a lot of different pieces and it looks different depending on what you're measuring. So let's break these each out. When it comes to diversity, these are the hard numbers, right? When we say it's not a numbers game, well, with diversity and representation, it kind of is, because it's just that. One thing I will call out, I always call out because I can't help myself, is that diversity is not an individual level measurement. Like right now, I am the only person in this room, right, as a Black woman, so I can't really say like, oh yeah, it's a diverse room because I'm here. It's just me. But once you start putting other people in this room, that's when you can say, okay, now let's look and see, you know, across these different identities, are we all, is it homogeneous or is it different? And so that's, I just always love to call that part out with diversity. So anyways, getting back into the slide, with demographics, you can look at your workforce data. So there were a lot of people talking about, you know, through hiring, retention, turnover, and just looking at the hard numbers of who's leaving, who's staying, who's appearing, who's showing up. And then also the important piece that we called out, leader level, right? So looking at that in all these different ways. So that's diversity. You can get that from your HRIS. A lot of you are probably looking at that for EEOC, as again, that's that legal piece that does crop up. But then on the other side, there's equity. And so with equity, this is in regards to power and resources. So this is reviewing your pay, your policies, what are those procedures you're doing? And there are organizational audits out there that can help you, especially like pay equity audits are a big one, but there are other equity audits as well, where you can really look through and see who is utilizing the different benefits available in your company, and is it impacting everyone the same, or does that look different? And then there's inclusion. Now, when we talk about inclusion, we talk about inclusion in terms of behaviors. And so it's how we're treating people. And so you can look at that as leader level behaviors. It can be coworker, peer-to-peer, and so on. So a lot of different levels there. And you can get this through other report data. So asking people, how frequently are you encountering these behaviors from a certain person? Or maybe it's observational. So there are some really interesting tech companies out there that can help you do things like organizational network analysis. It can help you to see like who's interacting with who. It can also be looking at, your outlook, who's attending meetings with who, and how often are certain people being left out. So you can look at behaviors in hard numbers as well. And then the last thing is around belonging. And so when it comes to belonging, this one is self-report. This one is that personal belief or feeling, and it's the result of feeling included. So those inclusive behaviors lead to feelings of belonging. And let's dig into that piece a little bit more. So this model here is something that after a lot of research, we've come up with. So there's a lot of confusion out there about how we accurately measure workplace inclusion. I know earlier someone mentioned, just not sure what to do or how it all comes together. And through our extensive research and background as IO psychologists, we determined that this is the big picture of what needs to be measured to get the full sense of what DEI looks like in your organization. Belonging is the sense that your authentic self is valued, respected, seen, and heard. And while that's key, right, I have that there in the center, all of those factors on the left contribute to belonging. And people are more likely to feel like they belong in your organization when they see others who look like them. So that's that diversity, or more importantly, representation. That representation is really key. It's also when they feel like they're treated fairly, so they're wanting to see, are things just? And then are they treated by others in a way that makes them feel valued, respected, seen, and heard? So again, that's that inclusion, whether it's coworker inclusion or peer inclusion, or inclusive behaviors from their leadership as well. And so when people, encounter these things, it leads to feelings of belonging. But what's important on the business side, again, is when people feel like they belong, they're more likely to want to work at an organization, and that's the attraction piece. They're more invested in their work, and that's that engagement piece. And then they're also more likely to stay at that organization. So that's helping with that retention and turnover. So that piece is really key. And then one last thing, just really quick for my data nerds out there, there are some correlations, and we've put those in there. And if you wanted to continue, kind of geek out on the side, definitely reach out. Myself, another colleague, Kelsey or Victoria, would be happy to chat about the nerdy stats in relation. So the last chunk here that we said we'd get into, right, that's around the how of DEI in data. And so with the how, there's some pieces here that we want to talk about. We talked about the first piece some already, right? The importance of hard data. So this was, depending if we're talking about diversity, it's looking at demographics. If we're talking about equity, it's digging into who is assessing your resources and getting opportunities. If we're talking about inclusion, well, that's behavior. So frequency and getting some hard numbers on who's actually performing behaviors. And then feelings of belonging, that is that perception piece from people. Are they feeling like they belong as a result of the other three? But then on the other side, outside of there being the quantitative or hard data, there's also qualitative soft data, and that data is important as well. We like to say that the quantitative data tells you where to look, where to start focusing in, but the qualitative helps give you a more robust picture. And that comes in the form of doing interviews. A lot of times interviews are one-on-one, and maybe doing that with leadership to see what's going on with them at the top. And then focus groups, that can help you, again, if you're seeing some pain points for different identity groups, sitting down with people who are in that identity to see how they're feeling and why those things may be coming up. And it's not to say that, they can speak on behalf of every single person. That's why it's important to have multiple people, but it can give you some insight in having multiple to dig a little deeper too. And then also the open-ended comments. So that is the best way to try and hear, some qualitative insight from across the board, making sure you have that when you're doing surveys. So that's a little bit there on the hard and then the soft. But what's important is coming all together with that. So once you have it all together, the important part is to look deep into your findings. One of the biggest errors I see from companies is they go and they collect all of this data and they have all of this data and they stop at that top level, and it's not enough. If you're an organization with less than 10 people, then sure, you can maybe stop there at that overall level because you don't have enough to meet what we call min-in, right? For enough responses to break out into different groups. But otherwise, you need to double click. You need to dig deeper into your data and see, okay, well, one level down, let's use gender, for example. You go one level down, you look at how you're men, you're women, you're non-binary, and so on, right? You go ahead, drop down, how are they all feeling? Now, click down again. How are your Black women feeling versus your white women, and so on, and look across identities in different levels in different ways and see how people are experiencing your organization. That double click is really important in getting into that intersectionality. But another version of the double click that can be overlooked as well is not just doing that in one of your forms of metrics, but across metrics. So for instance, you see people are responding a certain way on your survey, you collected some data that way. Well, now let's go look and see how are they doing with their performance metrics. You know, the people who scored low, are they performing well in the organization, or maybe looking across their initial onboarding. If you do onboarding interviews, that's something that some people do. Comparing across your different data collections is an important form of double click as well. And then again, as we talked about earlier, just being sure that you're collecting data of different types across all levels, but also getting all levels involved in the next steps as well. So a lot of times, again, once you have that data, it can be a little scary to let it go, but it is important to make sure that your employees are hearing this, especially your employees from those underrepresented groups, and that you're acknowledging, hey, we hear you and we see that you're having a different experience. And again, this is what we're doing about it. So that last piece of turning those insights into those actions, that's really the most important part. And being sure to tie those actions to your original why. So when we started this, we talked about the why, right? So being sure that you tie that together and with the overall business strategy. And again, just making sure you're communicating that out. So that was a lot of information. I wanted to do one last thing before we wrap up today, and that's going to be to take a quick look at how all of this could come together. And so I'm going to use our model as, sorry, Winston sees someone outside. I'm going to use our model to talk about how this may look in an organization if you were trying to do this. So hopefully this example help you get your brain spinning a little bit of what you might be able to replicate. So for us, we have our Mattingly Inclusion and Belonging Assessment. It's a validated process that we've developed, and it's a way to collect metrics. And as you can see there, it involves a few of those pieces we talked about, so that qualitative data and quantitative. And when building the MIBA, we took into account the research we discussed earlier, so the different pieces that all relate to belonging and then the outcomes that come from that. And so when going through this process, you get some really good insights, and then it's going to lead to protection against not just turnover, but also, reduced efficiency and loss of talent. But it's also going to promote performance, creativity, and those feelings of belongingness, because that's the most important part, right? And the well-being of your employees. That's the goal. So let's dive deeper into what that process actually looks like. So again, you can see how the steps of data collection could come together. So for our process, we start with collecting that information. So executive interviews, and that helps again with gaining that buy-in from the senior leaders. They feel like they're a part of the process, and they're like, oh yeah, my voice is being heard too. This is where I want the company to go, and it helps get their support, but it also helps get that baseline of where are your senior leaders in regards to DEI, right? So that qualitative data, again, is important. And then doing a live kickoff video. So that helps, again, with that transparency and communication. Now your employees know why you're collecting that data. So having that initial conversation up front before just asking them to supply the data can be really useful. And then the actual data collection. So the pre-survey, and then the last piece is, again, collecting more focus or some more qualitative data, right? So doing some focus groups based on the pain points that came out of the quantitative survey. So then the next piece that's really important is reporting that out. So based off of the findings in that first phase, creating a roadmap saying, hey, here's the data, here's what we saw, here's what matters to you as employees, and here's what we're going to do about it. And so that action focused report, and not only again creating it, but sharing that out with the organization is really important as well. And then it's finally getting into the action. So a lot of people like to start with action in the interventions, but collecting this data and tying that to your why is a really important first step, or well, first two steps to happen before you get to this third one. And when you implement those interventions, they can look different. It's not all about trainings. I think that's another very common mistake that happens. Once you have your data, look into it. Maybe it is training and education is what you're lacking, but it could be that, you know, your employees aren't feeling like they have a community, so you want to develop some employee resource groups. Or maybe they feel like they're not having the same opportunities as others, so you're like, okay, we really need to look into our performance evaluation system and how people are being promoted. So that's why it's so important before you get here to collect that data and then build your data-driven strategy, because it will help you know, okay, like we talked about in the beginning, right? This is where we need to focus. Focusing on this area is what's actually going to help our employees feel better about the environment here. And then the last piece that's important, like we talked about already, is that continued measurement. So measuring throughout the year when you're completing interventions, but then also a year later, completing that survey again and being able to measure year over year. Where have we seen progress? Where should we continue working? Maybe there's new pain points, you know, things aren't going to be stagnant. As new people come into your organization and leave and things in society happen, your needs are going to change. And so it's important to keep an eye on that and keep reviewing. And then I do want to dig into one other part of the MIBA, just because I know you all came here about data and measurement, and you know we like surveys and you like surveys. So I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the measurement side of things and what our quantitative does look like and entail. And so with that, when it comes to diversity, again, that's about the representation, right? So the demographic composition of your organization. And a lot of times what happens here is organizations don't have that data, or maybe what they have is very basic. So they tend to have age, of course, because you have birthdays, and then they have gender and ethnicity. Those are usually the three that you can pretty reliably count on. But there's so much more than that, right? We talked about intersectionality. So we have a number of demographic questions in the MIBA. So that's a way for self-report to happen, and you can be able to really dig deep, as we talked about. And then the next piece there are a number of items, or the rest of the items actually, sorry, are employee perception on how they feel on these things. But for the first couple, it's trying to make it as behavioral based as possible. So equity, that's going to dive into resources and how people are impacted from different groups. The coworker inclusion and leader inclusion, that's getting into that frequency as I talked about. So really narrowing it down on, are those behaviors happening? And then belonging, that's making sure their voice is heard. So are they feeling valued, respected, seen, and heard? And giving some data on each of those categories, and then also summarizing that into an overall MIBA score, which is out of 100. So that's the kind of data that the survey collects and what goes into the report. And then again, leaning into summarizing what came out of the interviews and summarizing the focus groups and open ends, because we always say you shouldn't collect data if you're not prepared to report out on it. So if you do include those qualitative pieces, it's important that when you're reporting out your data, you summarize the qualitative as well. And then, you know, summarize and recommend your next steps too. So I want to just highlight one more time, this is just one example of how you can start with DEI data. The MIBA, it's just one example. It's a great way to start a conversation, but the MIBA and any other method similar to it that I'm sure you may be doing internally, while it's a great place to start, I just want to highlight and stress one more time that it's only a kickoff point. It's to know where to look next and where to keep going. And that's not just in your actions, but also what other data you might need. For instance, I mentioned pay equity earlier, right? You may find by starting somewhere like this that there are concerns. And so, okay, the next step is we need to collect some equity data around our pay and see if there's things we could be doing. Or maybe going in, you need a better exit interview process to see why people are leaving. You see they're leaving, but you don't know why. And so doing something like this is a great way to start a conversation, but it's important to keep collecting data and to continue digging. So that being said, I do just want to summarize again those 3 key takeaways that we touched on. The first one being starting by establishing the business case or moral case, right? What is your why? And that's going to vary and look a little different depending on your organization, because each organization is a little different in how you prioritize things, and what conversation is going to have the most impact. So figure out your specific why for DEI. It rhymes. And then clearly define your sources of data. So that's the what, right? Where are you going to be collecting this data? What data do you already have? What data can you get? And then lastly, taking that robust approach to collecting the data. And that's including that qualitative side, so the soft data, and getting the voice of your employee, but also hard numbers as well, because there's plenty of hard numbers out there that exist that you can collect. So that is all I had for official conversation today. I'm now going to open it up. Again, if you are around and you want to come on camera, feel free. And we're going to do a little Q&A. So go ahead and you can drop anything in the comments, or you can come on, like raise your hand, and we can go around and ask any questions that you may have. And I do have one question that was sent to me in a private chat, so I'll work on that, but definitely feel free to keep dropping questions in chat or raise your hand and I'll get to you. But the question here was, you mentioned engagement surveys, and is it, do you have to have a separate DEI survey if you have an engagement survey? And that's a really good question. So that is going back to the quote I had on that first page. And the answer is yes, we should definitely keep them separate if possible. I will say I'm never going to turn down data. And if the only way you can get data is to go ahead and get it from that engagement survey, then sure, do it. But if you can get access to having your own survey for DEI, it's really important, because a lot of times when you squeeze it into an engagement survey, there are a lot of other topics already being covered. You maybe get 4 or 5 items, and it's really just not robust enough. And so if you can do your own survey, that's where you can touch on all of those different dimensions as we talked about, right? And really get a more complete picture of what's happening and getting all of that demographic information up front, because a lot of times a DEI survey is the best and only place to get that level of detail. So it's a good question. Andrea, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, hello. I'm going to leave my camera off, not out of disrespect, but I have a cold and I look like I've been run over by a truck. And I also fell down while playing basketball with my son and sprained like half of my body. So for those reasons, I'm going to leave my camera off. But my question is in terms of the qualitative data recording and how exactly, if you're willing to share, I understand that some of this could be proprietary and I don't mean to ask for anything that's not shareable, but when it comes to quantification of that data, how does that happen? Is there like coding in the interviews, or is there some sort of like
good question
interview Likert scoring? Or I'm just curious about like how does that qualitative data become quantifiable?
That's a good question. So there are ways to quantify qualitative data, and some people are for it, some people are against it. For instance, doing sentiment and trying to give that a number isn't necessarily always the best, because it can be really hard to determine if something's positive or negative. So don't necessarily recommend that. Some people have come up with, I know a colleague of mine, Victoria Hendrickson, she's come up with a way to she's come up with a way to quantify comments, but again, that's a proprietary thing for the organization she works for. But a lot of places, there's actually research that says you shouldn't try and quantify necessarily, because it doesn't, since it is qualitative, it doesn't translate well. What people do like to do is topic modeling, and that's what we do here. And so it's not necessarily that we look at the comments and then assign some numeric value or even counts, because that's not necessarily useful, especially because, maybe it's counts, but if 20 of the 30 say NA, that's not super useful. So what is really useful is to actually read the comments and break them out on what topics are they addressing, and then to summarize and say, a majority of your comments were saying that we feel like we can't be promoted. Okay, now that's a specific thing and we can talk about that theme. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. And I apologize if I had misunderstood. I
Oh yeah.
thought that I heard you say at some point in the presentation that there was, like, in the MIBA, that's what I thought I understood, that in the MIBA that there was an inclusion of the qualitative data. And so I was
Yep.
super curious about how that would work. But topic
Yeah.
modeling makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Exactly. And that's how we do include it, but we just include themes and through topic modeling. Good clarification. Thank you for calling that out. And then is it Camilla?
Hi, I'm Camila.
Camila.
So I'm relatively new to this space, so this may be an elementary question, but Certrice, I heard you say that you were a survey person, so you are the one to ask. I know that when designing surveys and other instruments to gather sort of the baseline information, it's useful to include questions that maybe deal with some of the metrics the organization already has in place, or maybe some of the things that might be useful, specifically things that I would think are useful to know about a particular organization. But beyond that, what might be some resources that you could suggest that might direct us to maybe the types of questions we should be asking in order to create surveys that give us the best information?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my cheeky response is going to be, we have that book Inclusilytics coming out and we have a chapter on it. So there's that. But no, in all seriousness, it's a science, and that's why there are people who study this and how to create surveys. But in the short response would be first determining what is your purpose. So what are you trying to get at? What is the answer you're looking for? And then working backwards from there. But there's so many things to consider. It's, okay, well, if I want to ask this question, what are we going to ask? Like, how do we start? And then you're like, okay, is that a leading question? Start tearing the question apart in your head. Am I leading them to a certain response? Okay, maybe I should pull this part out. And then, okay, is this asking about perceptions, but I really want frequency? Do I need to change my scale? So there's a lot of things that come to mind. And so for me, something that I do sometimes that can be easier is I just put a question on paper, like this is the question, and then I just tear it apart, like I was saying, and looking for those issues. That's as far as creating a survey question from scratch. But then there are a lot of surveys out there where you can look and see, can you pull questions from other places to get at your needs? But it's really important just to know what are your needs in the first place, because it can be really overwhelming, the amount of information that's out there. And I'd also say, don't be afraid to ask for help, whether that's someone external, like a company like Mattingly Solutions, or internally. I'm not sure where you work, but if you have a people ops team, they'd be really useful, because 9 times out of 10, they have like a data analyst or an industrial organizational psychologist on staff who could hopefully help you out too. So, yeah. Also, really good question, not silly or, like you said, so don't be afraid. All right, I see at least one other question in the chat, and definitely feel free to keep coming off mute or dropping in chat. If not, we'll wrap up after this one. But from Scarlett, suggestions on how to report out on certain demographics when there is a small number of people with that identity, folks in the trans non-binary community, for example. This is wonderful. Also, I love that you like the title of the book. We worked hard on it, so I love that. But yeah, so about that question, I'm going to say something that my stats professor from grad school, if they were in the room, they'd be a little sad, but you definitely still need to share this, especially for statisticians. It can be really hard to deal with something because they start worrying about power and so on and whatnot. And yes, that stuff is all nice to have from a research theoretical perspective, but especially when we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, we can't disregard data because of lack of responses, especially because, again, those communities are likely to be a little smaller in your organization. And for us to ask them for their information and then say, oh, JK, there's not enough of you, so we're just going to write it off, isn't going to make them feel better. And that's the whole goal of this, right? It's to figure out what their needs are so we can improve their experience and their well-being in the organization. So that being said, though, to narrow down specifically on reporting out, I would say that if the community is small, you can still report it out as long as there's at least 3 responses is the minimum in that we like to use. And that's for identity purposes, or sorry, anonymity purposes. With less than 3 responses, especially if there are only, like if there's only one person in the organization and everyone knows who that is, you don't want to break their confidentiality by sharing their results. So that's just a hard stop. You can't share it out if you don't meet that minimum in. But if you meet it of at least 3, put it out there, you know, and make sure you do something about it. So I hope that helps, Scarlett. And I'm gonna scroll down. I see some comments. Yes, this is exactly. We should not be using statistically insignificant as a phrase when we are talking about people, because that's how othering. Can you imagine how othering that would be if someone said that about you? It's like, you're statistically insignificant. Ouch. So definitely making sure you put that out there. Oh, yep. And I saw the comments from Andrea too. Great questions. Any other questions before we get ready to wrap up for today? I do have one more slide I'm going to share. Awesome. All right. So that being said, or actually 2 more slides, sorry. If you do want to continue this conversation and we didn't get to anything, or you have other questions, definitely reach out to us. You can schedule a meeting, or you can reach out on social media. We're all over social media and we check everything all the time. So, or you can email us, you know, whatever. We're happy to connect and continue this conversation. It's been a really fun one today. Appreciate how interactive you've been in the comments. It's been really great. And then the last thing, this one's big. Actually, if I'll drop this in chat too. I just realized I don't have that copied. Would really love for you to take part in our feedback survey. We practice what we preach here, right? And so we would love if you have any feedback on how you liked the webinar today. There you go. There's that link. If you could take the survey and just give me any feedback you have, I'd really appreciate that. So thank you again for being here. Please, please, please click that link and give us some feedback on the presentation. And as I mentioned before, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. We will be sending out a recording of the conversation today along with these slides. So thank you again for being here, and we will be hearing from you soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Let me know if you have any issues with that link. Thanks.